Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. This happened during a camping trip in northern Maine with my parents and my best friend Emily. We were planning to visit Acadia National Park the next day and needed somewhere to stay for the night. None of us expected that night would turn into the most terrifying experience of our lives. The trouble started when we arrived at Bar Harbor and found all the campgrounds fully booked. It was peak autumn season, with tourists flooding in to see the famous fall foliage. My dad spent an hour calling every campsite in the area, but everything was either full or way over our budget. Eventually, we found ourselves driving along a quiet forest road, looking for a spot where we could legally camp for the night. The GPS led us to a small gravel parking area near a state forest. When we pulled in, I noticed another vehicle already there, an old pickup truck parked in the shadows. Something about it looked off, like it had been abandoned, but I pushed the uneasy feeling aside. A couple was hiking nearby, so my dad asked them about camping in the area. They said it was a good spot, mentioning that rangers rarely checked this location. Initially, we considered setting up our tents near the beach, about 10 minutes walk away. But something told me we should stay closer to the parking lot. As we unloaded our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The pickup truck bothered me. It was covered in dust, with no one around. Emily noticed my unease, but tried to lighten the mood by suggesting we make s'mores later. We set up 2 tents, one for my parents and one for Emily and me. The afternoon faded into evening, and we settled in for the night. Emily and I were watching videos on my phone and snacking when we heard it, the distinct sound of metal striking ground, like a shovel being dropped onto gravel. We froze, looking at each other in alarm. The sound came from the direction of the pickup truck. We stayed absolutely silent, straining to hear more. Moments later, we heard what sounded like something heavy being loaded into the truck's bed, followed by the slam of the tailgate. The engine roared to life, and the truck sped away as if the driver was in a hurry to leave. Emily and I sat in terrified silence, our hearts pounding. I texted a friend who lived nearby, describing our location. He immediately replied that the area was known for illegal activities and warned us to be careful. Before we could process this information, a blood-curdling scream shattered the night. It was unmistakably human, a man's voice filled with terror and pain. Emily grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. I frantically texted my mom in the other tent, saying we'd heard a horrifying scream. The minutes that followed felt like hours. The forest had gone completely silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then we heard footsteps approaching our tents. They were careful, deliberate steps, like someone trying to move quietly but not quite succeeding. Our blood turned to ice as the footsteps circled our tent, then moved to my parents' tent, and finally to our car. Through the tent's thin fabric, I could sense someone studying our campsite. Emily and I huddled under our sleeping bags, barely breathing, phones clutched in trembling hands. Suddenly, headlights swept across our tents. The truck had returned. I peered through a small gap in the tent flap and saw the vehicle stop briefly. Its door opened and closed quickly, and then it sped away again. About 5 minutes later, we heard another vehicle approaching fast. This time it was a police car, its lights flashing as it followed the same direction as the truck. Emily and I were too terrified to stay in the tent. We grabbed our things and rushed to the car, locking ourselves inside. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the forest for any movement, while Emily eventually dozed off in the passenger seat. When morning finally came, my mom revealed she'd heard the footsteps too. What terrified me most was what she'd heard when the person passed their tent, heavy, labored breathing, like someone who'd been exerting themselves. As soon as it was light enough, we packed up and left, eager to put distance between ourselves and that forest. Later that day, I researched the area online and discovered something chilling. Not long before our visit, there had been a murder nearby, a man found buried in a shallow grave. 2 more people had disappeared from the same area and were still missing. The most disturbing part came months later, when I read about the arrest of 3 people connected to multiple disappearances in the region. They had been using that remote parking area as a dumping ground. The police report mentioned finding recently disturbed soil and tools in their truck. I still wonder about that night, who screamed, and what happened to them. Were we witnesses to something horrible? The thought that we might have been just a few hundred feet away from a murder still haunts me. To this day, I can't go camping without checking and double-checking the location first. Every unexpected sound in the woods makes my heart race. That night taught me that sometimes the most terrifying things aren't supernatural. They're the dark things humans do when they think no one is watching. Ghost stories had always fascinated me. Growing up in Savannah, Georgia, where every corner seemed to whisper tales of the past, it was hard not to be drawn to the supernatural. My friends and I loved sharing spooky stories during our sleepovers, but one October night, we decided to take our ghost hunting to the next level. We planned to visit Bonaventure Cemetery, one of the most historic and allegedly haunted places in the South. Spanish moss draped over ancient oak trees like funeral veils, and centuries-old statues stood guard over crumbling graves. The cemetery had been there since 1773, and locals swore that some of its residents never truly left. It was a cool evening just before Halloween when Riley, Matt, and I set out on our adventure. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple before surrendering to darkness. We rode our bikes down winding roads lined with old Victorian homes, their wraparound porches and ornate trim casting strange shadows in the fading light. We hid our bikes behind a massive live oak near the cemetery entrance. The wrought iron gates were impressive even in the growing darkness, their intricate patterns telling stories of a bygone era. Riley checked his phone's flashlight, while Matt tried to steady his trembling hands. I could feel excitement and fear mixing in my stomach, like a cocktail of adrenaline. The gate creaked loudly as we pushed it open, the sound echoing through the silent grounds. We slipped inside, our feet crunching softly on the gravel path. Rows of weathered headstones stretched into the darkness, some dating back centuries. Their inscriptions were worn by time and weather, but many still told tales of Savannah's earliest families. Ancient oak trees towered above us, their branches creating a natural canopy that seemed to trap the darkness. Spanish moss swayed gently in the breeze, creating shifting shadows that played tricks with our eyes. We passed elaborate monuments and statues of angels, their faces eroded by time, but still haunting in the dim light. Deeper in the cemetery stood a magnificent old mausoleum, its marble walls stained by ages of exposure to the elements. Fallen leaves carpeted the steps leading to its entrance. A weathered plaque identified it as belonging to the Morrison family, dated 1834. Local legend claimed that the Morrisons had all perished in a tragic fire, and their spirits still lingered, unable to find peace. We exchanged nervous glances before approaching the mausoleum. Our flashlight beams danced across its facade, creating eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The heavy iron door was slightly ajar, revealing a darkness deeper than the night around us. The air carried a musty scent of aged stone and something sweeter, like long-dead flowers. With hearts pounding, we pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees instantly. Our lights revealed walls covered in a fine layer of green mold, and ornate marble plaques marking where family members had been laid to rest. Delicate cobwebs stretched between corners, trembling with our every movement. Then Matt's flashlight beam caught something in the far corner, a figure standing motionless, dressed in what appeared to be a long, tattered shroud. We all froze, unable to breathe or speak. The figure wore some kind of veil that obscured its features, making it impossible to see a face. The silence was absolute until the figure slowly raised its head. Two pale points of light seemed to reflect our flashlight beams, piercing the darkness like ghostly eyes. A soft, rasping sound filled the air, like someone trying to draw breath through ancient, dusty lungs. That broke our paralysis. "Run," Riley gasped, his voice barely a whisper. We turned and bolted for the door, shoving it open wider as the figure took a halting step in our direction. My foot caught on a broken piece of marble as I scrambled out, nearly sending me sprawling. Outside, the night air felt shockingly cold against my face. We sprinted down the path, our footsteps echoing off the monuments. Branches scraped our arms as we ran past the old oak trees. Something seemed to be following us, whether it was our imaginations or the figure from the mausoleum. I couldn't tell. The shadowy shapes of the graves blurred together as we ran, and I found myself holding my breath, half expecting to feel a cold hand grab my shoulder at any moment. Finally, we reached the front gates, practically falling over each other in our haste to get out. We grabbed our bikes and pedaled faster than we ever had before, not stopping until we were back under the familiar glow of street lights, where the sound of passing cars and humming electricity never felt more welcome. When we finally caught our breath enough to speak, we all asked the same question. What had we seen in that mausoleum? None of us had an answer. The stillness, the shrouded figure, and those eerie glowing eyes were unlike anything in our ghost stories or horror movies. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure raising its veiled head, those points of light piercing the darkness. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard that same rasping breath in my room. We never went back to Bonaventure after dark, but sometimes when I drive past it during the day, I find myself staring at the old Morrison mausoleum. In the daylight, it looks like any other historic tomb, peaceful and silent. But I know what lurks there after sunset, and I always drive a little faster until it's out of sight. Years later, Riley, Matt, and I still talk about that night, trying to rationalize what we saw. Was it just shadows and overactive imaginations? A clever prank by someone who knew teenagers often snuck into the cemetery? Or did we truly encounter something supernatural? A remnant of Savannah's haunted past that still lingers in that ancient burial ground. I suppose we'll never know for sure. But one thing is certain. Sometimes the line between ghost stories and reality is thinner than we'd like to believe. And there are places where the past never truly stays buried. I grew up in the Carpathian Mountains of Ukraine, and despite what most people think about this region being fully explored, there were still some truly wild and mysterious places around us. During my university years, we discovered one such location, the ruins of an ancient castle near the village of Dovzhka. The castle sat perched atop a steep hill, surrounded by dense forest that stretched for miles in every direction, nearly reaching the Romanian border. The locals had passed down stories about this place for generations. According to legend, the castle was destroyed during a massive Tatar raid in the 13th century. The knights who defended it fought bravely, but were ultimately overwhelmed. The invaders slaughtered everyone inside, including women and children who had sought refuge there. The tragedy was so profound that people said the spirits of the fallen knights still wandered the ruins, forever standing guard over their failed fortress. Of course, being young and skeptical university students, we found these stories fascinating, but didn't really believe them. My friends and I were part of a local history club, and we'd often go exploring old ruins and historical sites. But this place was different. There was something about it that gave even the most rational among us pause. One autumn night, we decided to do an overnight expedition to the castle. Our group consisted of 4 people: myself, my best friend Maxim, an experienced hiker named Ole, and Taras, a local guy who knew the area well. We parked our car at the end of an old logging road and started hiking up the overgrown path that led to the ruins. As we walked, the dense canopy of beech and oak trees blocked out most of the moonlight, creating an eerie darkness broken only by our flashlight beams. The air was crisp, carrying that distinct autumn chill that made every sound seem sharper, more distinct. We could hear owls calling in the distance, and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. After about an hour of hiking, we reached the castle ruins. Even in the darkness, the ancient walls loomed impressively, their weathered stones telling silent stories of centuries past. We set up our camp in what used to be the castle's courtyard, finding a relatively flat spot among the scattered stones and wild vegetation. As the night progressed, I kept seeing something strange out of the corner of my eye. It looked like a tall figure in medieval armor, standing perfectly still beside one of the crumbling towers. Every time I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there. I tried to rationalize it as a trick of the moonlight on the stones, but something felt off. I didn't mention it to the others at first, not wanting to sound foolish. But then Maxim suddenly said, "Do you guys keep seeing someone in armor?" My blood ran cold. I wasn't the only one. We got to a point where we'd been exploring for over 2 hours, and the weird sightings continued. We debated heading back down the mountain, but it was already well past midnight, and navigating the forest in complete darkness seemed more dangerous than staying put. Just then, Ole started screaming and ripping off his jacket. We all thought he'd gone mad, but he insisted something had struck him. When we shined our lights on his back, we watched in horror as 3 long gashes appeared across his shoulder blades, as if made by an ancient blade. They weren't deep, but they drew blood and appeared right before our eyes. That was it for us. We grabbed our gear and practically ran down the mountain, our hearts pounding with every step. The descent was treacherous in the dark, but fear gave us extraordinary coordination. We made it back to the car without further incident, but we were all badly shaken. You could argue that the armored figure was just our imagination playing tricks on us in the dark. The shadows and moonlight could have created illusions among the ancient stones. But those gashes on Ole's back, they were real. And they appeared in a way that none of us could have done to him while standing in a circle around him. I've been back to the castle since then, but only during daylight hours. The ruins are actually quite beautiful in the sunshine, with wildflowers growing between the stones and birds nesting in the old towers. But I'll never forget that night, and I always leave well before sunset. Something tells me those ancient knights take their eternal guard duty very seriously, especially after dark. The castle has since become quite well known among paranormal investigators. A popular Ukrainian ghost hunting show even filmed their pilot episode there. It's fascinating to watch, but having experienced it firsthand, I know television can never quite capture the true intensity of standing in those ruins at night, feeling the weight of centuries of history, and perhaps something else, watching your every move. I've had several unsettling experiences in the mountains, but this is unquestionably the strangest. I've been turning it over in my mind for years, and I still can't come up with a rational explanation. In the summer of 2022, my research partner Pavel and I headed to Mount Haverla in the Ukrainian Carpathians to collect rare medicinal herbs that only grow at high altitudes. As pharmacy students, we were particularly interested in finding the elusive mountain arnica, which blooms for just a few weeks each year. The mountain is a popular tourist destination, with well-marked trails and plenty of hikers during peak season. To avoid the crowds and have better chances of finding undisturbed plants, we chose a less traveled route along the eastern slope. It was a challenging 6-mile hike, with a waterfall marking our primary collection site. The trail followed a mountain stream before ascending steeply to the alpine meadows. Simple enough, we thought. We were both experienced hikers in good physical condition, so we only packed light day packs with water, some sandwiches, and our collection gear. Getting back before dark should have been straightforward. We set out just after noon, taking our time to examine promising spots along the way. The hike up was beautiful. We passed a few locals heading down who wished us good luck in fluent Hutsul dialect. For the most part, though, we had the mountain to ourselves. We stopped occasionally to document interesting plants or take photos of the stunning landscape. I was tracking our progress on my phone's GPS, so I always knew our distance and remaining daylight. We reached the waterfall at about 3.2 miles, exactly matching our map. I paused the GPS tracker and we settled on a large boulder to rest and eat lunch. An elderly Hutzel couple was already there with their sheepdog. We exchanged greetings and kept to ourselves. That's when everything went wrong. While reaching for a promising cluster of arnica, Pavel slipped on the wet rocks and badly twisted his ankle. The sound of his startled cry echoed off the cliffs. The elderly couple heard him fall and came over to help. The three of us managed to get him back onto stable ground and assessed the injury. None of us were doctors, but it was clearly a severe sprain. The swelling began immediately, and Pavel could barely put weight on it. As we realized the seriousness of the situation, the elderly couple began backing away, looking strangely anxious. I asked if they could go for help, but they didn't respond. Neither spoke a word. They just turned and started walking away at an unnaturally quick pace, their dog following silently behind. I called out to them in frustration, but they never looked back. We had no cell service this high up, so calling for help wasn't an option. We had to hike back down. "It's okay," I told Pavel. "It's only 3 miles. We can do this." I transferred our water and gear to my pack so he wouldn't have to carry anything. We made decent progress at first. I was still tracking our descent on GPS. After about 2 miles, Pavel needed to rest. I told him to lean on me despite being shorter than him. It seemed to help. "We're almost there," I said. "Just 1 more mile." Despite the setback, we stayed positive. The sun was still up, and the mountain was beautiful. Pavel joked about his clumsiness, and I tried to comfort him. We both thought the ordeal was nearly over. Then I realized we'd been walking much longer than expected. I checked my phone. We'd gone 6.6 miles total. That meant the return trip was already longer than the entire hike up. That couldn't be right. I figured I must have made a mistake with the tracker, maybe not starting it until we were already well along. Regardless, the trailhead had to be around the next bend. But it wasn't. We went another half mile, then stopped to assess the situation. Over 7 miles, and still no sign of the end. What was happening? We talked it over and concluded it had to be a GPS malfunction. Pavel insisted we hadn't passed the trailhead, and we couldn't have taken a wrong turn because there were no other trails. Plus, the scenery was familiar. We saw landmarks we remembered from our ascent. It was definitely the same trail. At that point, we started to feel demoralized. But what could we do except keep going? Our phone still had no service. Pavel was in considerable pain, his ankle now twice its normal size. He was sweating heavily, and so was I. The whole situation felt increasingly nightmarish. When we went another mile and still didn't reach the trailhead, we panicked. Night falls quickly in the mountains, and we had little daylight left. We were almost out of water, had no rain gear or extra food, and our phone batteries were dying. Of course, we cursed ourselves for not bringing more supplies, but we were only supposed to be out for a few hours. Out of desperation, I yelled for help. We'd seen no one since that strange elderly couple, but I was sure we had to be close to the parking area. Even if no one was there, I was willing to shout myself hoarse if it meant rescue. To our dismay, nobody answered. We were alone. We reasoned that maybe we'd somehow missed the trailhead we started from, and were heading toward a different exit point. We were pretty sure that wasn't possible. but it was the only explanation that made any sense. We were definitely still on the same trail, and while we couldn't be certain, it seemed like the landscape had subtly changed. We no longer recognized the landmarks except for the stream. Should we turn back? We debated this for several minutes. If we were wrong, backtracking would guarantee spending a night on the mountain. Pavel couldn't handle that ankle much longer. We decided to press forward. "I'm not crazy, right?" I asked. That initial hike was only 3 miles. We went 3 miles to the waterfall. "Yes," Pavel agreed, wincing through his pain. The entire hike was supposed to be about 6 miles round trip. We've walked much further than that. I don't understand what's happening. When darkness fell, we picked up our pace despite the risk. Pavel pushed through his pain, driven by adrenaline and fear. The Ukrainian mountains have their share of predators, and being caught out there in the dark was the last thing we wanted. We were both terrified. Pavel hobbled along as fast as he could manage, and I kept my flashlight beam moving between the path ahead and the surrounding trees, watching for animal eyes. I was crying. The GPS showed we'd hiked 9 miles total. After 9.5 miles, we finally saw the trailhead sign and scrambled toward it. Relief didn't completely wash over me, though, because I expected we'd have to either hitchhike back to our starting point or trudge along the road for a few more miles. As we climbed the short set of steps up to the parking lot, exhausted and completely unnerved, I hoped to see a car, any car. My prayers were answered, but it was our car. We were at the same trailhead where we'd started. For a moment, Pavel and I just stared in shock. Our fear and misery were replaced by total confusion as we stood there processing what this meant. Then we heard movement in the forest behind us, footsteps that didn't sound quite human, and the spell was broken. We hurried across the parking lot toward our car. In those few seconds, I felt an intense dread I'd never experienced before or since. It was like being in a nightmare where something is chasing you, but your legs won't work properly, and you know the thing behind you is about to catch up. We managed to pile into the vehicle and speed away. I was shaking. Pavel was rambling about time distortion and dehydration, trying to rationalize how we could have lost our bearings so completely. We got out of the mountains and onto the highway, and it was a while before we encountered any other cars. I didn't fully relax until we made it back to civilization. Neither of us can figure out exactly what we experienced that day. Pavel was on crutches for months after the incident, and his ankle has never been quite the same. We still go hiking, but we stick to the popular trails now. Whatever happened up there on Hovla that day, we don't want to experience it ever again. I'm from the remote Polesha region in northwestern Ukraine, where ancient marshlands stretch as far as the eye can see. I grew up surrounded by stories of old creatures and legends, but I've also seen things that can't be easily explained. My village sits roughly 60 miles north of Rivne, nestled among vast swamps and dense forests. The area is now part of a national park, but the old stories suggest it was someone else's territory long before humans arrived. Growing up, I was always told about the Baloshinik, the marsh dwellers. These mysterious beings were said to be small in stature, but incredibly strong and clever. According to the elders, they even spoke an ancient dialect of our language. The old folks said that long ago we lived alongside them, fishing together in the endless maze of water channels and helping each other survive the harsh winters. But everything changed when large-scale land reclamation projects began in the 1960s. As the marshes were drained and channels were dug, the Baloshiniks' homes were destroyed. Many disappeared into the remaining wild swamps, while others, it was said, took revenge on the machines and workers who transformed their land. That's when the relationship between humans and marsh spirits turned sour. There are countless stories of people being led astray in the marshes, following mysterious lights only to find themselves completely lost. But there are also tales of the Baloshinik helping humans in times of need. Old fishermen tell stories of unprecedented catches when strange, shadowy figures would herd fish into their nets during particularly harsh winters. My own grandfather swore that during the famine of 1947, someone or something would leave fish on his doorstep at night. In my personal experience, I've encountered these beings several times. Sometimes they appear as small, human-like figures moving through the mist. Other times, they're just a blur in the corner of your eye, gone when you turn to look directly at them. I believe they exist in a space between our world and another realm, which is why they can't always be seen clearly. The most vivid encounter I had was during a late autumn fishing trip. I was checking my nets at dawn, pushing my old wooden boat through the narrow channels between the reeds. The morning mist was thick, turning everything into gray shadows. Suddenly, I heard splashing that wasn't caused by my oar. Through the fog, I saw what looked like a child-sized figure walking on a patch of floating vegetation. It moved with incredible agility, never sinking into the treacherous marsh. As I watched, frozen in place, more figures emerged from the mist. They were gathering something from the water, perhaps small fish or water plants. Their movements were fluid and coordinated, like a well-rehearsed dance. One of them turned toward me, and though I couldn't make out its features clearly, I felt its gaze pierce right through me. To my surprise, I wasn't afraid. There was something ancient and deeply familiar about these beings, like meeting a long-lost relative. They continued their work, seemingly unbothered by my presence. After a while, they melted back into the mist, leaving me to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. But when I pulled up my nets later that morning, they were full of fish, more than I'd ever caught in a single night. Among the fish was a strange, old-looking metal pendant, covered in unfamiliar symbols. I still have it, though I've never shown it to anyone else. The marshlands of Polesha hold many secrets. The Baloshinik are just one part of this mysterious world. Some say they're still protecting what remains of their territory, watching as humans encroach further into the wilderness with each passing year. Others believe they're slowly fading away, like morning mist under the summer sun. I've heard scientists and scholars try to explain away these stories. They talk about swamp gas causing strange lights, and how isolation and fog can play tricks on the mind. Maybe they're right, but there's something about those misty mornings on the marsh, when the world is quiet and still, that makes you question what you think you know about reality. The next time you find yourself near our ancient marshlands, pay attention to the shadows between the reeds and the movements in the mist. You might catch a glimpse of something that challenges everything you believe about the world around us. Just remember to show respect. The marshes have been here long before us, and their original inhabitants haven't forgotten that fact. This is the story of an experience I had at the abandoned White Elephant Observatory on Mount Pip, Ivan, in Ukraine's Chornohora Range. Despite causing no physical harm, it has haunted me into adulthood. I work as a meteorologist, and my research often takes me to remote mountain locations to study weather patterns and atmospheric phenomena. The observatory, built in the 1930s, sits atop one of the highest peaks in the Ukrainian Carpathians. It was once a state-of-the-art meteorological station, but has been abandoned since World War II. The locals call it the White Elephant because of its massive white stone walls that emerge from the mountain mists like some mythical creature. Professor Taras, my research supervisor, and I planned a 2-day expedition to collect data and document the building's current condition. The observatory had been my obsession since graduate school. I'd read every paper about it, studied all the old photographs, and dreamed of exploring its ruins. When we finally got permission to visit the site, I could hardly contain my excitement. We lived in a small research station near the village of Verkhovina, where we monitored mountain weather patterns. The locals were always supportive of our work, but seemed uneasy when we mentioned our plans to stay overnight at the White Elephant. They would cross themselves and mutter something about the voices in the fog. Despite their warnings, we set out early one spring morning. The hike was challenging, but manageable, a steep climb through dense spruce forest before emerging onto windswept alpine meadows. The weather was clear when we started, but mountain conditions can change rapidly. About 2 hours into our ascent, we entered a thick bank of clouds. The temperature dropped sharply, and visibility decreased to mere feet. Professor Taras suggested turning back, but I insisted we continue. We had GPS coordinates and proper equipment. What could go wrong? Then I heard it, a voice speaking in the old Hutzel dialect. Kao des Cyrillic letter 456, te yeri sudei. Come here. It seemed to come from somewhere in the fog ahead of us. My first thought was that another research team might be up there, though we hadn't heard of anyone else having permission to visit. Did you hear that? I asked Professor Taras. He nodded slowly, his face pale beneath his weather-beaten complexion. We called out, but received no response. Just as we were about to continue, we heard it again, this time from a different direction. Kao des Cyrillic letter 456, te yeri sudei. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It had an otherworldly quality that made my skin crawl. We stood frozen, listening as it called again and again, each time from a different location, as if circling us in the fog. Professor Taras, a man of science who'd spent 30 years studying mountain weather patterns, looked genuinely frightened. We need to go back, he said firmly. But as we turned to descend, we realized we couldn't tell which direction we'd come from. The fog had become so thick, it seemed to swallow our flashlight beams. The voice grew closer. Now it was whispering other things, old words in a dialect so ancient we could barely understand them. It spoke of storms and lost travelers, of dark nights and forgotten paths. Each whisper seemed to come from just behind us, but when we turned, there was only swirling mist. We pressed on, hoping to find shelter in the observatory ruins. After what felt like hours, the massive structure finally loomed out of the fog. But something was wrong. We'd approached from the wrong direction, coming face to face with a wall that shouldn't have been there according to our maps. The voice followed us into the ruins, echoing through empty corridors and abandoned rooms. It seemed to be leading us somewhere, calling us deeper into the building. The White Elephant was a maze of collapsed floors and crumbling walls, far more complex than any of the floor plans I'd studied had suggested. Eventually, we found ourselves in what must have been the main observation room. The ceiling had partially collapsed, allowing the fog to pour in like a waterfall of gray mist. The voice was clearer here, almost gentle, speaking of measurements and observations, of stars and storms, using technical terms that hadn't been used since the 1930s. That's when we noticed the logbook. There on a rusty old desk lay an open journal, its pages seemingly untouched by decades of exposure to the elements. The last entry was dated September 19th, 1939, the day the observatory was abandoned as war broke out. The handwriting matched the words the voice was whispering. We ran. I don't remember much about our descent, only that we moved with the desperate energy of hunted animals. The voice followed us halfway down the mountain before finally fading away. When we reached the tree line, the fog lifted as suddenly as it had appeared. Back in Verkhovina, an elderly local woman nodded knowingly when we told her what happened. She explained that the last observers never really left the White Elephant. Their measurements were too important, their duty too sacred. They still take their readings, she said, and sometimes try to share them with those who understand their importance. I've continued my research in the Carpathians, but I've never returned to the White Elephant. Professor Taras and I rarely speak about what happened that day. The logbook photos we took came out blank, and our recording devices captured nothing but static. But sometimes, on foggy nights when I'm analyzing weather data, I swear I can hear a distant voice speaking in that ancient dialect, reciting measurements from a station that officially ceased operations over 80 years ago. I work as a field botanist for a prestigious research institute in Kiev, recently contracted by the Carpathian Biosphere Reserve. My first assignment has been documenting rare orchid populations in the primeval beech forests. The work involves hiking to specific GPS coordinates and conducting detailed surveys of the plant species, taking photographs, and setting up small weather stations to monitor microclimates. Some locations are unmarked trails, but many are deep in the wilderness where humans rarely venture. The ancient forests of the Carpathians are unlike anything else in Europe. Some trees are over 400 years old, creating a cathedral-like canopy that filters the sunlight into an ethereal green glow. When you're deep in these woods, you feel like you've stepped back in time to when the world was young. Sometimes there isn't any accommodation nearby. These are remote mountains, after all. The reserve has provided me with high-quality camping equipment for overnight stays. I'm an experienced field researcher and have spent countless nights alone in the wilderness throughout my career. I'm a woman in my early 30s, physically fit from years of field work and not easily frightened. The reserve also equipped me with an emergency beacon that would bring forest rangers to my location within hours if needed. I've been working in this area for several months now and have truly enjoyed it. The Carpathians are incredibly pristine and untouched, which is exactly why I do this work. I get to document species that most people never see, and I've had many profound moments of connection with nature. At least that was true until a few nights ago. I was working near the highest peaks, where some of the rarest orchid species grow. Snow and ice storms had been frequent, despite it being late spring. I was camping in the area to complete my surveys, and while the conditions were harsh, I was almost enjoying the challenge. My first night in the woods was peaceful. I made dinner, set up camp, and settled in with some herbal tea and my field notes. I slept soundly, wrapped in my sleeping bag despite the cold. I woke at dawn to find strange markings in the snow around my campsite. Not tracks exactly, just disturbed snow, as if someone or something had been pacing around all night. Odd, but I had 15 kilometers of difficult terrain to cover and rare plants to document. I didn't have time to dwell on it. I spent the day photographing and mapping orchid populations, marking GPS coordinates, and taking soil samples. I never wear headphones in the field. Hearing is crucial in the wilderness. You need to be aware of weather changes, wildlife, or other potential dangers before you see them. It was already dark when I made it back to camp, and I was exhausted. I barely had energy to eat before crawling into my sleeping bag and falling asleep. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to voices. Voices when I was kilometers from the nearest road, behind locked Forest Service gates, and far from any hiking trails. My heart started racing. I quietly retrieved my flashlight and emergency beacon from my pack, got back in my sleeping bag, and listened intently. All my senses were on high alert. The voices continued, speaking in a language I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't Ukrainian, Romanian, or any other local language I knew. Eventually, the voices faded, but I never went back to sleep. At first light, I emerged from my tent to find more churned-up snow. But this time, there was something else. My research equipment, which I'd left at sites kilometers away, was hanging from a tree near my tent. Equipment I'd carefully hidden under moss and leaves to protect it from the elements was now displayed like some kind of warning. I packed up as quickly as possible and hurried back to my research vehicle. Along the way, I saw countless footprints in the snow around my campsite, and when I reached my car, I discovered it had been broken into. My laptop and all my backup equipment had been stolen. I'm currently in a hotel in the nearest town, too frightened to retrieve my remaining field equipment, and too embarrassed to tell my supervisor how terrified I am. The reserve brought me a new vehicle, while mine is being repaired. I filed a police report about the theft, but there's no way I'm going back to that site. I don't know if this will cost me my job or relegate me to lab work for the rest of my career. But in all my years of field research across Ukraine's wildest places, this is the most terrified I've ever been. I'm not afraid of the wildlife. I have many stories about encounters with bears, wolves, and lynx. I'm afraid of whoever was out there in those ancient woods, watching me, following me, speaking in that strange tongue. Maybe they were protecting something. Maybe they were warning me away. Or maybe they had darker intentions. But one thing is certain. Those primeval forests hold secrets that some of us aren't meant to discover. I was reading through a mushroom foraging forum earlier today that described an encounter that sounded like something from a horror story. I was ready to dismiss it as creative writing until something about it hit too close to home. It was eerily similar to an experience I had last autumn on Mount Petros in the Ukrainian Carpathians. I've been studying mushrooms as a hobby for years, particularly the rare species that grow in our mountains. Petros is known for being somewhat remote and rugged, offering perfect conditions for some of the most elusive fungi species. The isolation appealed to me. There's usually enough solitude there to forage in peace. The day started normally enough. The morning fog was lifting as I made my way up the narrow mountain trail, my collection basket and field guide ready. The weather was perfect for mushroom hunting. Recent rains had left the ground damp and fertile. The mountain was showing off its autumn colors, with patches of mist still clinging to the valleys below. About 2 miles into the ascent, a faster hiker overtook me. Rather than just nodding and continuing on his way, he stopped and matched my pace. He introduced himself as a shepherd, though something about him seemed off from the start. He didn't have any sheep with him, for one thing. Nothing particular was strange about what we discussed: local mushrooms, weather patterns, the mountain paths. But something was deeply unsettling about him. He was too intense, too familiar. His friendliness felt almost artificial, like someone imitating human behavior they'd only observed from a distance. His Ukrainian had an odd accent I couldn't place, ancient sounding, yet not quite like any dialect I knew. I remember him telling me how he really enjoyed testing visitors to the mountain. But lately, nothing seemed challenging enough. "Nobody provides real entertainment anymore," he said, with an unnatural smile. Not like in the old days. The way he spoke made my skin crawl. His presence was really unnerving me, so I made an excuse to stop and check my mushroom basket. The strange shepherd kept walking, and I thought that was the end of it. I had an amazing rest of the morning, finding several specimens of rare mountain fungi. His unsettling presence faded from my mind as I focused on my foraging. I found a perfect spot near an old shepherd's hut and settled in to document my findings. As night fell, as often happens when you're alone in the mountains, I started getting increasingly uneasy. My mind kept returning to how weird that shepherd had been, how he'd acted like someone performing the role of a human being. To ease my anxious mind before sleeping, I placed my mushroom knife within easy reach, right next to my sleeping bag. I eventually dozed off after reviewing my field notes and identification photos. I slept unusually soundly, not waking once during the night. When I woke in the morning, I felt unusually refreshed. That is, until I went to grab my collection basket. Its location wasn't the issue. It was exactly where I'd left it, leaning against the hut's wall about 5 feet from my sleeping bag. What terrified me was that every single mushroom had been meticulously sorted by species. Each variety was arranged in perfect concentric circles, with the rarest specimens placed in the center. Some of the mushrooms hadn't even been in my basket the night before. They were varieties I'd been searching for but hadn't found. I checked my knife. Its wooden handle had been intricately carved overnight with ancient Hutzel symbols I'd seen in ethnography museums. Looking at those carvings made my eyes hurt. like they depicted something my mind wasn't meant to comprehend. I set what must have been a speed record getting down that mountain. The whole way down, I felt watched. The morning mist seemed to follow me, forming shapes that were almost human, but not quite right. Several times I heard what sounded like someone walking parallel to my path, just out of sight in the fog, matching my pace exactly. The mushrooms I brought back were later confirmed to be some of the rarest species ever documented on Petros, including 2 varieties previously unknown to science. I never told anyone about how I really found them. The knife sits in a box in my basement. I can't bring myself to get rid of it, but I don't want to look at those symbols again. When I go mushroom hunting these days, I stick to the more popular areas. Whatever happened that night on Petros, whatever kind of shepherd that was, I have no interest in encountering it again. Some parts of the mountains, I've learned, belong to beings far older than us, and they don't always appreciate human visitors in their domain. I'm a wildlife photographer specializing in the Carpathian Mountains, and I recently experienced something in an old shepherd's caliba that I can't explain. Despite causing no physical harm, it has fundamentally changed how I view these ancient mountains. The caliba, a traditional wooden shelter, sits high in the Chornohora Range, far from any marked trails. These structures have served as shelter for shepherds and travelers for centuries. Built from massive spruce logs and topped with a steep roof, they're meant to withstand the harshest mountain weather. In summer, shepherds still use them while grazing their sheep on the high meadows, but by late autumn, they're usually abandoned. My colleague Mikhailo and I planned a 3-day expedition to photograph the rare Carpathian lynx. The caliba would serve as our base camp, allowing us to be in position for dawn and dusk, when the cats are most active. We'd heard from local rangers that several lynx had been spotted in the area. The hike up was challenging but beautiful. The autumn colors were stunning, with patches of mist drifting through the valleys below us. We reached the caliba by late afternoon. It was larger than most, well built, with space for at least 6 people to sleep. The previous summer's shepherds had left it clean and had even stacked some firewood inside. That first evening, we settled in comfortably. The old stone fireplace still worked perfectly, filling the shelter with warmth and the scent of burning pine. We reviewed our maps, planned our shooting locations, and discussed camera settings over hot tea. Everything felt normal, even peaceful. Around 3 in the morning, I woke suddenly, not from any noise, but from an overwhelming sense of wrongness. I lay there in my sleeping bag, trying to identify what had disturbed me. Then I heard it, the sound of the heavy wooden door creaking open, followed by deliberate footsteps across the floor. I froze. The footsteps were slow and steady, moving around the main room with purpose. My first thought was that another photographer or hiker had found the shelter, but something felt deeply wrong about these movements. They were too measured, too precise. The footsteps continued for several minutes. Then came the unmistakable sound of someone, or something stirring the dying embers in our fireplace. Suddenly, the fire flared to life, without anyone adding wood. The room filled with an unnatural blue-tinged light. By this point, Mikhailo was awake too. We lay there, barely breathing, as the invisible presence moved around the caliba. The temperature dropped dramatically. Our breath came out in visible clouds, despite the freshly stoked fire. The footsteps circled our sleeping bags, so close we could feel the floorboards move. Then came the whispers. They weren't in Ukrainian or any language we knew. They sounded ancient, like wind through old pine needles or water over mountain stones. The whispers seemed to be discussing us, pointing out our cameras, our modern gear, our presence in this ancient place. The next morning, we found our cameras had been moved. Not roughly or carelessly. They were arranged with extraordinary precision, all lenses pointing toward the eastern window where the sun would rise. When we checked the memory cards, every camera had a single additional image. A perfectly focused shot of the Kaliba's interior taken at 3:15 a.m., showing 2 empty sleeping bags illuminated by blue firelight. Neither of us had taken that photo. Neither of us had even touched our cameras after setting up our equipment for the next day's shoot. The metadata showed the photos were taken simultaneously on all 3 cameras, an impossible feat given their positions in the room. We left that morning, abandoning our plans for lynx photography. As we hiked down, an elderly shepherd was bringing his flock up for late autumn grazing. When we mentioned our experience, he crossed himself and explained that the Kaliba was built on the site of an ancient place of worship. The old ones who used to conduct ceremonies there never really left, he said. They're still performing their rituals, still keeping watch over their sacred ground. Now when I photograph in the Carpathians, I stay in modern shelters or my tent. But sometimes, when I'm processing images late at night, I swear I can hear those ancient whispers again, like they followed me down from the mountain. I've never shared those photos from the Kaliba. Looking at them makes my eyes hurt and my head spin, like they contain something our modern minds aren't equipped to process. The mountains of Ukraine hold secrets far older than our written history. Some of these secrets still walk the high meadows, still tend fires in old Kalibi, still whisper in languages long forgotten by human tongues. I've learned to respect their territory and their privacy. After all, we're just visitors in these ancient hills. Other beings have called them home for far longer than we can imagine. I had one of the most terrifying experiences of my life a few months ago while climbing Mont Blanc with my friend Marcus. The mountain stands at 15,780 feet tall, with its magnificent peaks piercing through the clouds. It's one of those iconic alpine summits that every serious climber dreams of conquering, and we were both excited about the challenge ahead. We started our ascent early in the morning, taking the classic route from Chamonix. The weather was perfect, clear skies, gentle breeze, and surprisingly warm for early spring. Marcus, being an experienced alpine climber from Bavaria, led the way while I followed, carefully watching his technique on the steeper sections. Everything was going smoothly until we reached about 13,000 feet. That's when I started feeling strange. At first, it was just a slight headache and mild dizziness, but as we climbed higher, the symptoms intensified. My vision became slightly blurred, and my breathing felt labored. Marcus noticed my struggle and suggested we take a short break. "Richard, you don't look good," he said, concern evident in his voice. Maybe we should turn back, but I was determined to reach the summit. We had planned this climb for months, and I wasn't about to give up when we were so close. Looking back, That stubbornness nearly cost us dearly. As we approached 14,000 feet, the weather suddenly changed. The clear sky transformed into a menacing gray mass, and dark clouds rolled in from the west. The temperature dropped dramatically, and the wind picked up, howling through the rocky outcrops like a wounded animal. Then came the thunder, not the distant rumbling you hear in the valleys, but sharp, crackling explosions that seemed to shake the very mountain beneath our feet. We were completely exposed on the ridge, with nothing but rock and ice stretching endlessly in every direction. The situation worsened when I realized I had dropped my emergency kit somewhere along the way. The altitude sickness was getting severe. My head was pounding, and the world seemed to spin around me. Each step required immense concentration, and the thin air made every breath a struggle. Marcus grabbed my arm and shouted over the wind, "We need to descend." But the visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The storm created a whiteout condition, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. We started our descent, but every step was treacherous. The wind threatened to knock us off our feet, and the temperature had plummeted so low that ice was forming on our equipment. I remember thinking, this is it. This is how people die on mountains. The next hour was a blur of careful footwork, clinging to rocks and fighting against the relentless wind. The thunder was directly overhead now, and I could feel the electricity in the air. My ice axe started buzzing, a warning sign that lightning was imminent. We finally managed to reach a slightly lower elevation, where we found some shelter behind a large rock formation. The storm raged on above us, but at least we were out of the direct path of the lightning. My altitude sickness began to ease slightly, but the fear and exhaustion remained. As we huddled there, waiting for the storm to pass, Marcus shared stories of other climbers who had faced similar situations. "The mountain always has the last word," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We're just guests here." When the storm finally began to clear, we made our way down as quickly as safety would allow. The descent was challenging, but the relief of being alive overshadowed any physical discomfort. We reached Chamonix just as darkness was falling, exhausted but grateful. That experience taught me something crucial about mountain climbing. It's not just about reaching the summit. The mountain doesn't care about your plans or ambitions. Nature operates on its own terms, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is turn back. I still climb, but that day on Mont Blanc changed my approach forever. Now I pay more attention to weather forecasts, take altitude sickness more seriously, and most importantly, I listen when the mountain tells me it's time to turn around. Some lessons you only need to learn once, and facing death on a storm-ravaged mountain peak is definitely one of them. I was reading a hiking forum post earlier today that reminded me of something strange that happened to me in the Bavarian forest a few years ago. At first, I wanted to dismiss the post as just another creative writing exercise, but something about it struck too close to home. I was camping in the Bavarian Forest National Park, known for its ancient woodlands and dense spruce forests. The area is remote, with vast stretches of untouched wilderness extending all the way to the Czech border. I was there with my 12-year-old son Lucas, who's already an accomplished young outdoorsman. He can pack his own gear, start a proper campfire, and knows more about forest wildlife than most adults. My father Heinz was with us too, though he's more of a casual nature enthusiast than a serious hiker. We had planned a simple overnight trip, just wanting to spend some quality time together in the wilderness. The weather was perfect for camping, and we found a nice spot along one of the marked trails. By the time dusk settled in, we had our camp set up perfectly. Lucas was already asleep in his tent, and I didn't last much longer, falling into a deep sleep as soon as darkness fully enveloped the forest. In the early hours of the morning, long before sunrise, I woke up suddenly. The air felt unusually still, almost dead. It was the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when I heard it, a distinct knocking sound, like someone striking two thick branches together. Knock, knock. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, definitely not random forest noise. It wasn't close enough to feel immediately threatening, but near enough to hear clearly. The sound repeated 3 times, with several minutes of absolute silence between each occurrence. I lay there in my sleeping bag, my heart racing, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was a deer, perhaps some night hikers, but the rhythmic nature of the sound was unsettling. It was too regular, too intentional. I grabbed my phone and started researching possible explanations. That's when I stumbled upon local folklore about the Walgist, forest spirits, that were said to communicate through wooden knocks. Some stories suggested they were guardian spirits, while others portrayed them as mischievous entities that led travelers astray. The knocking continued, always in the same pattern, 2 distinct knocks, followed by silence. It seemed to move around the perimeter of our campsite, never getting closer, but never really moving away either. I thought about waking Lucas or my father, but I didn't want to frighten them. By the time the sun started to rise, the knocking had stopped. I never told my son or father about it. What would be the point of scaring them? But I did make a mental note that if I ever heard something like that again, I would try to document it, maybe even respond to it. I've been back to that forest several times since then, but I've never heard anything like it again. The only thing that's changed is how I listen to the forest at night. Now, when the wind shifts, or when the darkness feels particularly heavy, I find myself paying extra attention, wondering if I'll hear that mysterious knocking again. Some might say it was just the natural sounds of the forest playing tricks on my mind. Others might suggest it was indeed something more mysterious. All I know is that the Bavarian forest keeps its secrets well, and sometimes it's better not to know all the answers. The experience has become part of our family camping lore, though I only shared it with Lucas years later when he was older. Now whenever we camp, he always asks if I've heard any knocking in the night, half joking, but with a hint of genuine curiosity in his voice. I just smile and remind him that the forest has its own language, one that we might never fully understand. This incident happened in 2018, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that we encountered someone truly dangerous that day. My boyfriend Marco and I were on a road trip through northern Italy, and we decided to spend a day exploring the Dolomites National Park. The landscape there is breathtaking, towering limestone peaks, lush green valleys, and winding mountain roads that seem to touch the clouds. The park has a scenic route that winds through the mountains, with various stops along the way to view different landmarks and hiking trails. We had only reached our second or third stop when we encountered him. This particular stop had a large parking area with educational panels about local flora and fauna, and a trail leading up to an ancient chapel and several panoramic viewpoints. As we started up the path toward the main site, a man was coming down toward the parking lot. He was remarkably tall, at least 6 feet and 2 inches, with striking blonde hair and wearing a bright red jacket. As we passed each other, he muttered something under his breath, clearly trying to get our attention. Marco turned around and asked "Scusi." The man looked startled for a moment, as if he hadn't expected us to respond, before pointing into the distance and asking in broken English, "No joke, what's that over there?" All we could see was a maintenance shed, the winding road through the park, and the magnificent mountain peaks. We shrugged it off, said we didn't know, and turned to continue up the path when he called out, "See you later, Bella Ragazza." While every woman who's been to Italy has heard similar comments countless times, something about his tone felt unusually sinister. We tried to ignore the encounter and headed up to the viewpoint. After 15 or 20 minutes of taking in the scenery, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. Marco nodded and said, "That guy hasn't left. He's been watching us the whole time." From our elevated position, we could see the parking lot below. The man was standing near an information panel at the far edge of the lot, positioned perfectly to keep us in view. We stayed at the viewpoint longer than planned, hoping he would leave. By the time we returned to the parking lot, he was gone. We drove a couple kilometers to the next stop, which featured some ancient rock carvings you could view using provided binoculars. The access road was narrow, creating a bottleneck at the entrance. As we approached, a blue SUV pulled in front of us. Blocking our way, it was him. After a few moments of intense eye contact with Marco, who later said he'd never felt such malice from another person, the man slowly pulled away and let us enter. He left, so we told ourselves we were overthinking things, but decided to spend extra time at this stop to let him get well ahead of us. Our next stop, about 6 kilometers away, was a 1-mile loop trail. We figured we'd spent enough time at the rock carvings that even if he was at our next destination, he'd either be finishing up or leaving by now. Unfortunately, he had waited for us. About 3 kilometers down the road, we spotted the blue SUV pulled over on the shoulder. The man was standing beside it, seemingly admiring the view, though there was nothing particularly spectacular about that specific spot. As we drove past, I watched in the mirror as he turned to stare at our car until we rounded a corner and lost sight of him. When we reached the parking lot for the hiking trail, we were both thoroughly unnerved. Marco, who normally brushed off creepy encounters, was so disturbed by this man's presence that he actually grabbed a small emergency hammer from his car safety kit and put it in his pocket. The trail descended into a small valley, winding down through limestone formations and alpine meadows. We made it to the bottom, where the path split into a circuit around several fascinating rock formations. We were about halfway around when we noticed him at the trailhead, about to start the descent. We felt relieved, knowing we'd be out before him this time and could finally shake him off. Most of the loop was visible from the parking area, but the middle section, was hidden behind a rocky outcrop. When we emerged from the hidden section, we quickly looked around to locate him, but he was nowhere to be seen. Maybe he decided not to do the walk. Maybe he was behind one of the rock formations. As we made our way back up the steep path, we spotted him at the top, just waiting by an information sign. Switchback after switchback, he stayed put, apparently reading intently. As we got closer, we noticed he was now holding something. When we reached the top, where we'd have to pass within inches of him, we linked arms and prepared to walk past as quickly as possible. He had a windshield squeegee and spray bottle in his hands. As we tried to pass, he turned to us and said, "Hey, can you help me?" "I'm running out of time," Marco firmly replied. "No, leave us alone." The man, smiling, responded, "Well, goodbye then. Nice bodies, both of you," and started following us. He was gaining on us by the time we reached our car, and I barely made it inside and locked the door before he was right next to my window, staring in at me. Though terrified, I didn't want to show weakness. I looked directly into his eyes, and what I saw made my stomach turn. He was pressed against my window, hand frozen in a wave, smiling unnaturally. When I met his gaze, my first thought was that he wanted to do unspeakable things to us. Marco had the presence of mind to start taking photos of him, which prompted the man to move around our car, trying to prevent us from leaving. Marco started the engine, attempting to intimidate him. It didn't work, he just kept blocking us. We inched the car forward. Still, he wouldn't move. We bumped him slightly, and he stumbled back but maintained his position. Then we noticed a family in a nearby car watching us. The man noticed them too, gave that awful smile one last time, and finally gave us just enough room to get out of the parking spot. As we sped away, the father in the other car gave us an encouraging nod, as if to say, "We saw everything. We've got your back." I immediately called the park office and reported the incident. They sent rangers to investigate. We drove to the nearest town and stopped at a cafe to calm our nerves. We were so rattled that we actually checked the car for tracking devices, which sounds paranoid now. But something about that man's demeanor made everything feel more sinister than it should have. Later that evening, we received a call from the ranger, who informed us they had arrested the man for disorderly conduct and asked us to provide a statement. I've tried to find out more about what happened after we left, but I haven't been successful. I still wonder about the strange windshield washing ploy. Was there something in that bottle? Was the squeegee somehow weaponized? Maybe we were overreacting, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that we narrowly escaped something terrible that day. Despite causing no physical harm, this experience in the Tatra National Park has haunted me well into adulthood. I grew up near the Tatras, where my parents worked as wildlife researchers. They regularly visited the deepest wilderness areas during their field studies, disguising these trips as family camping adventures. I never minded. I was just as passionate about the outdoors as they were from a young age. That is, until what happened that night. We lived near Lake Strbski Pliso, a popular tourist destination. This was the only place my parents would allow me to camp alone, provided I brought Max, my German Shepherd, with me. He was a former police dog, exceptionally well-trained and intelligent. At 12 or 13, I didn't mind the restriction. It felt like my own slice of freedom in my personal wilderness. Despite being surrounded by tourists, it was easy enough to find quiet spots away from the crowds. As I got older and more confident, I started pressing my parents to let me venture deeper into the park with my quad bike, wanting to test my abilities and prove I wasn't a child anymore. It was that overconfidence that led to the situation that still gives me nightmares. I was 15 when it happened. At that age, I thought I was invincible and knew everything there was to know. After countless rejections from my parents, I decided to go anyway. I told them I was camping at the lake with friends, but instead took my tent and quad bike and headed deep into the reserve. I left at sunrise to maximize daylight and rode until I found a perfect spot. After setting up camp and having some food, I decided to explore the area. I knew of a fascinating rock formation nearby where others had found ancient artifacts, so I thought I'd try my luck. Shortly into the walk, I realized I was lost. I had a compass and knew that heading south would take me back to the lake, but it was getting late. Stupidly, I decided to try finding my way back to camp instead of taking the safe route to the lake. It was about 4:30 in the afternoon when the forest went silent. When I say silent, I mean absolutely silent. No wind, no birds, nothing. The silence was suffocating. Darkness was approaching, and all I wanted was to get back to my camp, light a fire, and spend the night watching the flames until I fell asleep. That's when I heard it from every direction. The sound of twigs snapping and something moving in the canopy above. Then, clear as day, a voice called out, "Come here." At first, I felt relieved, thinking another hiker had spotted me and wanted to help. But looking around, I saw no one. Then it happened again from behind me, the same voice. But this time it came from up in the trees. "I can't see you." "Where are you?" I called out, hoping for help. But the voice came again, this time from my left. That's when I started running. I sprinted for about 2 minutes before stopping to catch my breath and check my compass to head toward the lake. Seconds after checking the compass and starting to walk, I heard it again. "Come here," right behind me. I spun around and saw absolutely nothing. I began sprinting again and didn't stop. The last thing I heard before bursting out of the trees onto the lakeshore was the most horrifying laugh I've ever heard. It sounded like 3 people laughing simultaneously. I immediately called my parents to pick me up, confessing everything. They were more focused on my disobedience than my experience. But the moment they arrived was the first time I felt safe again. I cried the whole way home and couldn't sleep properly for days. My father retrieved my quad bike and packed up my camp the next day. Since then, I haven't ventured beyond the lake area. The experience took away my passion for deep wilderness exploration. I miss being out in true solitude, but I can't bring myself to go back into those remote areas. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has had similar experiences in the Tatras. The mountains here are ancient, and local folklore speaks of forest spirits that lure unwary travelers astray. Whatever I encountered that day destroyed my teenage sense of invincibility and taught me to respect the wilderness in a way no lecture from my parents ever could. I work as a field researcher for a prestigious university and was recently contracted by the German Forest Service. My first assignment has been in the Bavarian Forest National Park, a vast wilderness area stretching along the Czech border. My job is relatively straightforward. I receive GPS coordinates and either drive or hike to designated locations to set up trail cameras, monitor equipment, and conduct surveys. The Forest Service had specific requirements that seemed odd at first. They wanted cameras placed exactly 3 feet off the ground, with some infrared cameras mounted in trees at precise heights. While some locations were on marked trails, others were deep in areas where humans rarely ventured. Sometimes there weren't any guest houses nearby. The Bavarian forest is remarkably remote, with dense mountain forests stretching for miles. On occasions when I needed to camp, the Forest Service provided me with high-quality equipment. I'm a woman about 5 feet 6 inches tall, but I've never been particularly afraid of working alone in the wilderness. The emergency beacon they gave me could summon every forest ranger within 50 kilometers at a moment's notice. I've been working in this district for several months now and have genuinely enjoyed it. The Bavarian forest is incredibly pristine and untouched. That's why I do this work. I get to experience things most people never see, and I've had many profound, almost spiritual moments. At least until a few nights ago. I was working near the Grosser Rachel Peak, the second highest point in the park. Winter was approaching, bringing howling winds and freezing temperatures. I was camping there to complete my work, and despite the harsh conditions, I was almost enjoying it. The first night was peaceful. I made dinner, set up camp, had some whiskey, and enjoyed a bit of high-quality cannabis. I slept soundly in my sleeping bag, protected from the cold by my balaclava. I woke at dawn to build up my fire and start coffee, when I noticed disturbed snow around my campsite. Not footprints, just churned up snow, as if something had been circling the area. Odd, but I had a 15-mile hike ahead to set up cameras, so I couldn't dwell on it. I never wear headphones while working. Hearing is crucial in the wilderness. You need to detect any animals or people before you see them. It was already dark when I returned to camp, and I was too exhausted to do anything except strip down to my base layer and pass out. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to voices. People talking. I was 30 kilometers up a restricted forest road, behind locked gates, and 10 kilometers from where I'd parked my car. I could hear voices. My heart nearly stopped. I quietly retrieved my firearm from my pack, got back in my sleeping bag, and waited, every sense heightened. Eventually, the voices faded, but I never went back to sleep. At daylight, I emerged to find more churned up snow, and my 2 trail cameras hanging from a tree 5 feet from my tent cameras. I'd placed 15 kilometers away from camp. I packed up as fast as I could and practically ran back to my car. Along the way, I saw numerous boot prints around my campsite. When I reached my vehicle, I discovered it had been broken into, my laptop and other equipment stolen. I'm currently in a luxury mountain lodge, too terrified to retrieve my remaining equipment, and too embarrassed to tell my supervisor how scared I am. The Forest Service brought me a new vehicle while mine is being repaired, and I filed a report about the theft. But there's no way I'm returning to that site. I don't know if this will cost me my job or confine me to desk work. In all my years doing field research in national forests across Europe, This is the most terrified I've ever been. I'm not afraid of animals. I have many stories about wildlife encounters. It's the people that frighten me. The locals tell stories about the Walgister, forest spirits that play tricks on travelers, moving their belongings and mimicking human voices. But I know what I saw. Those were human boot prints in the snow. Sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones from folklore. They're the ones walking among us. I was camping in the Norwegian mountains near Jotunheimen National Park, not at an official campsite, but deep in the wilderness, where I wouldn't expect to see another human for miles. The landscape was breathtaking, ancient peaks carved by glaciers, pristine lakes, and valleys that seemed untouched by time. One night I woke up and heard something outside. I unzipped my tent, and there he was, a man sitting by where my fire had been, right outside my tent. There was nothing particularly remarkable about his appearance. Just an ordinary-looking man in his 50s, wearing traditional Norwegian hiking gear. But he was just sitting there, a couple of feet from my tent, no backpack or equipment with him. Just sitting there in the middle of nowhere. When he saw me open the tent, his eyes widened as if he'd seen a ghost, and he took off into the darkness. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day, I managed to rationalize it. Maybe he was another hiker who had set up camp nearby without my knowledge, and was just disoriented. Maybe he was high on something, and had wandered from one of the distant mountain huts. Then 2 days later, and 15 kilometers away, in completely random directions that nobody could accidentally follow, things got truly unsettling. I was sitting by my fire that night when I started hearing noises that I became increasingly convinced were made by a person. I called out, "Who's there?" From the darkness, a voice responded, "Do you know how to get to Glittertind?" I replied, "No, that peak is at least 30 kilometers from here." They kept talking from just outside my line of vision. I tried to spot them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Put that away." Something in their voice made me comply. I didn't want to antagonize whoever was out there. After about 15 minutes of me being thoroughly unnerved, while they asked completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer. I shone my light that way again, and it was the same man who'd been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had followed me almost 15 kilometers over 2 days. There's no way he could have just accidentally wound up in the same spot in such vast wilderness. As soon as my light hit him, he disappeared into the darkness. I started to chase him, but quickly realized how dangerous it would be to pursue someone through the wilderness at night. Over the next 3 days, I hiked back to civilization, constantly doubling back, trying to throw off anyone following me. I would occasionally hide and wait to see if he would pass by. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the mountains. During the first night of hiking out, twice, I heard what sounded like someone walking circles around my tent. But when I gathered the courage to look, there was never anyone there. On the second night, I heard what I initially thought were animal calls in the distance, but slowly realized they sounded more like a human imitating animal sounds. However, I never saw that man again. I literally almost cried when I finally reached my car. The relief was overwhelming. To this day, it's probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. I have no idea who that man was, or what his intentions were, and no way of getting an explanation. But I really can't articulate just how terrifying those few days were. The vast, empty landscape of the Norwegian mountains, which had once seemed so peaceful, had become a place of primal fear. The experience changed how I approach solo hiking. Now I always carry a satellite phone, share my planned route with multiple people, and stick to more popular trails. The wilderness is beautiful, but it can also hide dangers that have nothing to do with wildlife or weather. Sometimes the scariest things in nature are the other humans we encounter there. What I'm about to share might sound impossible, like one of those stories you'd dismiss as fiction. But I swear every word is true. I've been a field technician for almost 5 years, servicing equipment in retail stores across Michigan. The job involves a lot of driving, and I've seen my share of strange things on the road. But nothing comes close to what happened that night along the remote stretches of northern Michigan. I'm not a trucker, but my job requires extensive travel. That particular night, I was driving between Harbor Springs and Petoskey, roughly a 30-mile stretch of mostly farmland with scattered small towns. Picture endless fields stretching into darkness on both sides, broken only by the occasional farmhouse light in the distance. The highway cuts through like a black ribbon, disappearing into the night. The weather had already turned nasty when I left Harbor Springs. I just finished a 14-hour shift, and exhaustion was setting in. Dark clouds were gathering overhead, that ominous shade of slate that promises a serious storm. The wind had picked up considerably, making my SUV sway slightly. I called my wife to warn her about the weather, especially since I'd be driving through some isolated areas. The forecast had mentioned thunderstorms, and judging by the sky, we were in for a rough night. I promised to check, and once I reached somewhere safer. Before hitting the road, I stopped at a small diner for coffee and a quick bite, knowing I needed to stay alert. The next few hours weren't going to be easy, especially with the approaching storm. Anyone who's driven through Michigan farmland at night knows how isolating it can feel. Add a storm to the mix, and it becomes downright eerie. About 20 miles into my drive, that's when things started getting strange. The hail began first, not large, but coming down with incredible force. Being from Michigan, I'd seen my share of storms, but when hail starts falling in midsummer, it's usually a sign of something worse to come. That's exactly what happened. I pulled over onto the shoulder, the wind now violently rocking my vehicle. The darkness was absolute. No other cars, no lights, just the sound of hail hammering against the roof. I shut off the engine and rolled down the passenger window, hoping to get a better look at the approaching storm. I always keep a heavy-duty flashlight for inspecting equipment, and I used it now to scan the horizon. The beam cut through the rain, but something was off. Despite the obvious storm, there were no lightning flashes, no thunder, just more darkness. It felt wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath. That's when I saw him. There, pressed against my driver's side window, was a face that still haunts my nightmares. A man, if you could call him that, with skin so pale it seemed to glow in the darkness. His eyes were deeply sunken, like black holes in his skull, and his smile. God, that smile! It stretched impossibly wide across his face, filled with teeth that looked too sharp, too numerous to be human. I froze. My heart seemed to stop in my chest. Through the glass, his breath created patterns of frost, despite the summer night. He didn't move, just stood there grinning at me, his face inches from mine. I've never experienced terror like that moment. This overwhelming, suffocating dread that paralyzed every muscle in my body. I don't know how long we stared at each other. It could have been seconds, or minutes. Time seemed to stop. Then slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and pressed it against the window. His fingers were unnaturally long and thin, like spiders' legs. And as they touched the glass, frost patterns spread from his fingertips. But it wasn't just frost, he was drawing something. Through the condensation, his fingers traced erratic patterns that made no sense, yet somehow filled me with an inexplicable horror. The entire time, that grotesque smile never wavered. Then, without warning, he wiped the window clean with his sleeve and vanished. One moment he was there, the next nothing. Just empty darkness where he had stood. I slammed the SUV into drive and floored it. I didn't care about the hail or the rain or the wind. I just needed to get away from that place. When I finally reached a gas station, I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. I checked the driver's side window later, looking for any trace of the frost patterns he'd drawn. Nothing. The window was clean, as if it had never happened. I checked my dashcam footage too. We have cameras running constantly for insurance purposes. There was nothing on the recording. No man, no frost patterns. Nothing that could explain what I'd seen. I know what you're thinking. Maybe I was hallucinating from exhaustion. I've driven through worse conditions before, worked longer hours, but I've never experienced anything like that. The pure wrongness of his presence, that smile that seemed to defy human anatomy, those eyes that held nothing but darkness. It was all too real. I still drive that route sometimes, but never after dark. If I have to go to Harbor Springs, I make sure it's during daylight hours. I'm not saying I'm convinced it was something supernatural, but I can't explain what happened that night. The only thing I know for certain is that it felt real, too real to ignore. Sometimes I wonder about what I saw. Was it just a trick of light and shadow, my tired mind playing tricks on me? Or was it something else entirely? I don't have answers, just questions that keep me awake at night. And that smile, that impossible, terrifying smile, I'll never forget it. Anyway, that's my story. I know some people will call it a hallucination or the product of an overworked mind, but I know what I saw. Sometimes I catch myself checking my rearview mirror more often than necessary, especially on dark stretches of road. Because deep down, I can't shake the feeling that whatever I encountered that night, it wasn't something I was meant to see. This happened during a long drive through the backwoods of Maine with my girlfriend Rachel. We were heading back from Portland to our hometown, taking the scenic route through dense forest areas. It was late, around 2 in the morning, and the kind of darkness that seems to swallow everything beyond your headlights. The GPS had routed us onto this narrow state highway instead of the main interstate. One of those decisions that seems reasonable at the time, but makes you question your judgment later. Rachel was sound asleep in the passenger seat, so I had the radio off, letting the quiet of the night settle around us. I was being extra cautious, because we'd recently heard about a friend's collision with a moose that had totaled their truck and left them with a broken collarbone. These massive creatures are no joke. They can weigh up to 1,000 pounds, and their dark fur makes them nearly invisible at night until it's too late. The road ahead curved sharply, so I slowed down considerably, remembering all the warning signs we'd passed about wildlife crossings. That's when I saw something emerging from the tree line that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a moose. A massive timber wolf, easily twice the size of any I'd ever seen, stepped out of the darkness. Its fur was silver gray, almost luminescent in my headlights, but what struck me most was its face scarred and battle-worn, with eyes that reflected an eerie amber glow. Blood matted the fur around its muzzle, fresh enough to glisten in the light. I pulled the car to a complete stop, my heart hammering in my chest. The wolf was enormous, standing nearly as tall as the hood of my car. This wasn't natural. No wolf should be that size. I tried to wake Rachel, but she was deep in sleep, exhausted from our long day. The wolf moved with an unnatural grace, its massive paws making no sound on the asphalt. It turned its head toward our car, and for a moment our eyes met. There was an intelligence in that gaze that sent chills down my spine, something ancient and predatory that spoke of more than mere animal instinct. I watched in the rearview mirror as the creature crossed the road, its movements deliberate and purposeful. Just before it disappeared into the darkness on the other side, it paused and looked back at our car one final time. Those amber eyes seemed to pierce right through me, carrying a warning or a message I couldn't understand. When I finally found the courage to drive on, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Rachel woke up shortly after, and I debated whether to tell her what I'd seen. She's lived in Maine most of her life, and immediately dismissed the possibility of it being a wolf, insisting they weren't native to this area anymore. I know what I saw. That creature was no ordinary wolf, its size, its bearing, the intelligence in its eyes. Everything about it defied natural explanation. When we passed through that area again in daylight, I noticed the dense forest pressing in on both sides of the road, and realized how many secrets those ancient woods might hold. I never saw anything like it again, but sometimes when I'm driving through remote areas at night, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those amber eyes emerging from the darkness. The incident left me with a profound respect for the mysteries that still exist in the wild places of our world, and a reminder that there are things out there that defy our understanding. The locals tell stories about the old forests of Maine, tales of strange creatures and unexplained phenomena. I used to think they were just folklore, meant to entertain tourists and keep children from wandering too far into the woods. Now I'm not so sure. There are things in this world that we can't explain, and sometimes it's better not to try. I've been driving trucks for several years now, and while I've encountered plenty of strange things on the road, one incident stands out as particularly disturbing. It happened during a long haul from Phoenix to Vancouver, a route that took me through some of the most isolated parts of Oregon. The main highway was closed due to a landslide, forcing me to take a detour through winding mountain roads. These weren't your typical back roads. They were narrow, poorly maintained paths that twisted through dense forests and steep ravines. The kind of roads that make even experienced drivers nervous. If you've ever driven through remote areas at night, you know how that complete darkness feels different. It's not just the absence of light. It's like the darkness has weight pressing in around you. There's no cell service, no radio signals, just you and the endless black beyond your headlights. Around midnight, I decided to pull over and rest. The nearest town was over 50 miles away, and something about this stretch of road felt wrong. The kind of place where if your truck broke down, you might not see another soul for days. I found a wide spot in the road, killed the engine, and climbed into my sleeper cab. The stillness was overwhelming. Not a single sound, except for the occasional creak of the truck settling. That's when I heard it, something hitting my truck. Not wind or rain, but distinct impacts against the cables between the cab and trailer. These cables are just inches from where I was lying, and I could hear each sound clearly. A tug, a scrape, a metallic rattle. I tried to dismiss it, but then I heard something else, the sound of heavy weight climbing onto my trailer. The whole truck shook with the impact. At first, I thought it might be a bear or some other large animal, but this felt different. The movement patterns weren't right for any wildlife I knew. Whatever was up, there was getting closer, and I wasn't about to wait around to find out what it was. Without thinking, I slammed my fist against the cab wall, hoping to scare off whatever was out there. What happened next still chills me to the bone. I heard a human scream. Not just any scream, but a blood-curdling shriek of terror and pain that echoed through the night air. Then came the thud, the sound of something heavy falling from my trailer. It wasn't a gentle landing. It hit the ground hard. Before I could process what was happening, I heard voices, multiple voices, shouting to each other in the darkness. But these weren't normal voices. They sounded strained, distorted, as if the people speaking were struggling to form words. I was paralyzed with fear, but I knew I had to do something. I grabbed my keys, flipped on all the lights, and threw open the door. What I saw in the harsh glare of my headlights defies explanation. Standing in front of my truck were 7 or 8 figures. They wore dark, tattered clothing that seemed to absorb the light. Their movements were wrong, jerky, and uncoordinated, like marionettes with tangled strings. They wore headlamps, but these weren't hikers or campers. Their clothes were filthy, torn, and their eyes held a wild, desperate look that spoke of something far beyond normal human experience. "What do you want?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. My heart was pounding so hard, I could barely hear my own voice. One of them spoke, his voice trembling. "We check abandoned vehicles. Secure them. Make sure no one's left behind." I replied firmly, "I'm not abandoned. I'm just resting." The group exchanged looks that made my skin crawl. A woman stepped forward. Her movements were particularly unsettling, like she was moving through water. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but all that came out was a long, ragged breath. "You need to leave," another man said, his tone unnaturally urgent. Now I didn't need to be told twice. I jumped back into the truck, slammed the door, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I could see them in my mirrors, standing motionless in the road, watching my departure. I drove for miles before I finally stopped at a truck stop to collect myself. When I told the staff about what happened, they looked at me like I was crazy. They'd never heard of any group of people wandering the roads at night, and when I mentioned how they moved and spoke, they just shrugged it off. I've never seen them again, but every time I drive through Oregon, especially at night, I can't help but remember those figures in the darkness. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but one thing's certain. They weren't normal people, and whatever they were doing out there wasn't natural. To this day, I won't stop on that stretch of road unless absolutely necessary. There's something out there in those woods, something that wears human shape but moves all wrong. And if you ever find yourself driving through remote Oregon at night and see headlamps in the darkness, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just keep going until you're back in civilization. During the summer of 1995, I attended a wilderness camp nestled in the Adirondack Mountains. The camp was built around Shadow Lake, a vast body of water carved by glaciers centuries ago. The lake's northern end was reserved for swimming, featuring a long wooden dock stretching into the deep, crystal-clear water. Beyond the main swimming area were two floating platforms, one nearby and another far out in the deeper waters. That distant platform had always intrigued me, though in my 3 previous summers at camp, I'd never seen anyone use it. It sat there like a forgotten island, weathered by sun and rain. Our group consisted of 12 11-year-olds, supervised by 2 counselors. One particularly hot afternoon, someone suggested swimming out to the distant platform. It seemed like a reasonable challenge for experienced swimmers, though looking back, I realize how dangerous it could have been. As we approached the platform, I noticed something unusual on the ladder, a creature unlike anything I'd seen before. It wasn't a common water spider. This was different. The creature was large, with a body span of about 2 inches, its legs thin and eerily elongated. What struck me most was its coloring, a deep midnight blue with intricate silver patterns across its back, almost like ancient runes. I hesitated, watching it carefully. The spider remained motionless, perched on the ladder as if guarding the platform. Something about its presence felt wrong, unnatural. After our long swim, we needed to rest, so I mentioned the spider to the others. We decided to climb up carefully, avoiding the creature. We took a few minutes to catch our breath, lying in the sun on the weathered wood. The platform had an unusual smell, not just the expected lake water and algae, but something else, something metallic and ancient. That's when everything changed. As the corner of the platform began to sink under our weight, hundreds of spiders emerged from between the boards. They weren't normal spiders. They were all like the one we'd seen on the ladder, midnight blue with silver markings. They moved with an unnatural synchronization, like a single organism with many parts. The panic was instant and overwhelming. Those of us still standing watched in horror as the spiders swarmed around our feet, their movements fluid and purposeful. Some of my friends jumped into the water immediately, but I stood frozen, watching the impossible scene unfold. The spiders weren't just emerging randomly. They moved in patterns, creating intricate designs across the platform's surface. Their silver markings seemed to glow in the sunlight, forming symbols that appeared and disappeared as they moved. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, like watching a deadly dance. The adrenaline finally kicked in, and I dove into the water with the others. As we swam back, I could feel something brush against my hair, not like weeds, but the distinct sensation of small bodies with long legs tangling in my wet strands. The memory of those creatures clinging to me still sends shivers down my spine. When we finally reached the safety of the main dock, we were spider-free, but forever changed. The counselors didn't believe our story about the unusual spiders, suggesting we'd seen normal water spiders, and panicked. But we knew what we'd witnessed was something else entirely. Looking back at the platform from the shore, it appeared normal again, just a weathered wooden square floating peacefully in the sunlight. But none of us ever swam out there again. The incident changed how I viewed the lake. Beneath its serene surface, it held secrets we couldn't comprehend. Years later, I learned that Shadow Lake had its own legends. Local stories spoke of strange creatures living in its depths, beings that weren't quite natural. Native American tales described the lake as a gateway to another world, a place where the veil between realities grew thin. That summer taught me something crucial about nature. Sometimes the most beautiful places hide the strangest mysteries. I've never seen spiders like that again, and part of me hopes I never will. But whenever I'm near a lake, especially one with floating platforms, I can't help but wonder what might be lurking between the boards, waiting to emerge. The image of those midnight blue spiders with their silver markings haunts me still. Not because they were necessarily dangerous. They never actually harmed us, but because they represented something beyond our understanding, a glimpse into a world that shouldn't exist within our own. That platform became their territory, a small island kingdom ruled by creatures that defied explanation. And perhaps it's better that way. Some places in nature deserve to keep their mysteries, even if they occasionally reveal themselves to unsuspecting visitors on a hot summer afternoon. There's something magical about road trips, especially when you start just before dawn. Watching the sun paint the sky in shades of amber and gold as you head toward a destination hundreds of miles away. But there are moments during these long drives when reality seems to thin out, when the boundaries between what we know and what we fear become blurred. I want to share 3 encounters with what I've come to call the warning cry. The first incident occurred during my drive from Seattle to Los Angeles. I'd planned a 3-day journey down the Pacific Coast Highway, wanting to enjoy the spectacular ocean views. The first day went smoothly, making it from Seattle to northern Oregon in about 12 hours. The second day started normally enough, moving from Oregon into California. Everything changed around 4 in the afternoon. The sky was clear, the ocean breeze gentle, and my Subaru's sound system was playing old indie rock when I heard it, a sound that defied description. It was like metal being torn apart, but with an almost musical quality, as if the very fabric of reality was being shredded. Instinctively, I pulled into a small turnout overlooking the Pacific. Before I could even process what was happening, the wind picked up dramatically. A few droplets of rain hit my windshield. Then suddenly, a wall of water materialized out of nowhere. Through the torrential downpour, I watched in disbelief as a massive waterspout formed just offshore, its funnel reaching from the ocean to the dark clouds that had appeared seemingly from nowhere. The second encounter happened 6 months later, during a winter drive through the Cascade Mountains. The snow had started falling gently, Nothing unusual for December in the Pacific Northwest. I was making good time, my all-wheel drive handling the conditions well, when that same horrifying sound cut through the quiet of the falling snow. This time I could have sworn the sound formed words, a warning in a language too ancient to understand. The moment I heard it, I swerved onto the shoulder. Seconds later, a massive avalanche thundered down the mountainside, crossing the highway exactly where I would have been if I hadn't stopped. The final encounter was the most intense. I was driving through the red rock country of Arizona, the summer heat creating mirages on the distant horizon. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by towering mesas and deep canyons. That's when I heard it again, that same reality-tearing shriek. But this time it was clearer, more purposeful. The sound seemed to say 13, a number that would soon make terrible sense. I took the next exit, finding refuge in a small motel despite having several hours of daylight left. The next morning, as I continued my journey, I counted them 13 vehicles scattered along the roadside, each one bearing massive gashes in their metal frames, as if something had torn through them with impossible force. Each incident followed a pattern. That otherworldly sound would pierce the air, defying description, yet demanding attention. It wasn't just noise. It was a warning, a moment of intervention from something beyond our understanding. The sound didn't just predict danger. It seemed to bend reality itself, creating a moment of safety in what would have been catastrophe. Local tribes along the Pacific coast have legends about the voice of the in-between, a sound that marks the boundary between our world and another. They say it appears to travelers in moments of great danger, a guardian force that exists in the spaces between what we can see and what we can only sense. The Cascade Mountain Rangers speak of the winter's warning, a sound that echoes through the peaks just before disaster strikes. In Arizona, the desert people tell stories of the 13th hour, a moment when time bends and reality shifts, marked by a sound that tears through the fabric of the world. These experiences changed how I approach long drives. I'm more attentive now, not just to the road and weather, but to those moments when the world feels slightly off-kilter, when the air grows thick with possibility, when the boundary between what we know and what we fear becomes paper-thin. I still love road trips, still chase the horizon with the same passion. But now I drive with a different kind of awareness, knowing that sometimes the universe itself might try to speak to us, to warn us, to save us from dangers we can't yet see. For those who spend long hours on the road, especially in those liminal spaces between cities, between day and night, between what we understand and what we don't listen carefully, that sound, that impossible shriek that tears through reality, might just be trying to keep you alive. The warning cry exists in that strange space where logic fails and instinct takes over. It's a reminder that our world is more mysterious than we imagine, that sometimes salvation comes in the form of a sound that shouldn't exist, a moment of intervention from whatever watches over travelers in their darkest hours. I've been involved in desert racing for years, working as a navigator for an off-road team in the Sonoran Desert. The job takes you to some of the most remote and unforgiving places imaginable. Between the scorching heat, treacherous terrain, and absolute isolation, it's not a career for the faint of heart. But out of all the strange and dangerous situations I've encountered, there's one night that still defies explanation. This happened during a moonless night run through the desert, about 50 miles south of Alter, Sonora. My partner Marcus and I were testing a new route for an upcoming race, driving our modified four-wheel drive through terrain that barely qualified as a road. The Sonoran Desert at night is a different world, pitch black except for the stars above, silent except for the occasional cry of a coyote. We'd been navigating for about 6 hours, making good time despite the challenging conditions. The temperature had dropped considerably, typical for desert nights, and the only light came from our vehicle's LED array and the countless stars overhead. The darkness was nearly absolute, the kind that makes you feel like you're driving through an endless void. Around midnight, we noticed something unusual in our rearview mirrors: headlights. This might not sound strange, but in this part of the desert, seeing another vehicle is rare, especially at night. The lights were intense, much brighter than standard headlights, like someone had mounted multiple LED light bars. At first, we didn't think much of it. Maybe it was another race team doing night testing, or local off-roaders enjoying the cooler night temperatures. But something felt off about those lights. They were getting closer, moving faster than anyone should be able to navigate these treacherous paths. The lights were blinding us through our mirrors, making it nearly impossible to see the dangerous terrain ahead. I tried signaling with my hand, hoping they'd dim their lights or back off, but they kept coming, getting closer and closer. We were approaching a particularly hazardous section, with sharp turns near deep ravines, and those lights were making it impossible to navigate safely. We had no choice but to pull off to the side, finding a relatively flat stretch of desert to let this aggressive driver pass. The second we cleared the path, we both watched as the vehicle with those intense lights raced past us at an impossible speed. What happened next still haunts my dreams. Instead of following the curve of the road ahead, the lights continued straight, directly toward a cliff edge. We expected to hear the sound of brakes, of metal crushing against rock, of a vehicle tumbling into the ravine. But what we witnessed defied all logic. The lights didn't fall. They didn't crash. Instead, they shot straight up into the night sky, ascending at an impossible angle. The brightness intensified for a moment, casting the desert in harsh white light, before vanishing completely into the darkness above. It was as if they'd been pulled into the sky by some unseen force. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. The silence of the desert pressed in around us, broken only by the idle of our engine. Finally, Marcus turned to me, his face pale in the dashboard lights. Did we just see what I think we saw? I couldn't find the words to respond. How do you rationalize watching a vehicle, or whatever it was, ignore gravity and shoot straight up into the sky? The desert night suddenly felt different, more threatening, as if we'd witnessed something we weren't meant to see. We didn't discuss it much after that. It seemed too impossible, too far outside the realm of what we understood about reality. When we reached our destination, we didn't mention it to the rest of the team. Who would believe us? A story about mysterious lights chasing us through the desert before flying into the sky sounds more like a fever dream than reality. But the incident changed something in us. We became more cautious during night runs, more aware of our surroundings. Every time we saw headlights in our mirrors, I couldn't help but tense up, wondering if we'd encounter that inexplicable phenomenon again. Years later, I learned that the local indigenous people have stories about strange lights in the desert, phenomena they call the Watching Ones. They speak of lights that follow travelers, testing them, observing them. Some believe these lights are ancient spirits. Others think they're something else entirely, visitors from somewhere beyond our understanding. I've spent countless nights in the desert since then, but I've never seen anything like those lights again. Sometimes, when I'm driving through particularly remote areas, I catch myself checking the rearview mirror more often than necessary, half expecting to see those intense lights approaching. The Sonoran Desert holds many secrets, most of which we'll never understand. That night, we glimpsed something that didn't belong in our reality, a phenomenon that challenged everything we thought we knew about the world. I don't know if it was something supernatural, extraterrestrial, or something else entirely, but I know what we saw was real. To anyone driving through the remote desert at night, especially in the vast emptiness of Sonora, keep an eye on your mirrors. If you see unusually bright lights approaching too fast, pull over and let them pass. But don't watch too closely. Some mysteries of the desert are better left unobserved. Some questions better left unanswered. In every small town, there are places people avoid, abandoned buildings with dark histories, streets where the shadows seem darker than they should be. But what happened at the old iron foundry on the outskirts of my hometown still haunts me, not just because of what I saw, but because of what I accidentally uncovered. The foundry had been abandoned since the 80s, its rusted skeleton looming against the tree line like a monument to forgotten industry. The building sat at the edge of town, where the paved roads give way to gravel, and civilization slowly dissolves into wilderness. Most people avoided it, claiming it was just another eyesore. But there was always something more sinister about that place. I was walking home one night around 11, taking my usual route past the foundry. The night was pitch black, with only an occasional streetlight flickering in the distance. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of machinery coming from inside the abandoned building. Not the creaking of old metal or the whisper of wind through broken windows, but the distinct hum of operating equipment. As I approached, I noticed something else. A car I'd never seen before, parked behind the building, barely visible from the road. It was a sleek black sedan, too new and too expensive to belong to the usual teenagers who sometimes broke in to explore. Common sense told me to keep walking, to mind my own business. But curiosity got the better of me. I moved closer, staying in the shadows, and that's when I saw them, two men emerging from a side door, carrying something wrapped in what looked like an old tarp. The object was large and awkward, requiring both men to maneuver it carefully. The men were massive, built like linebackers, dressed entirely in black. They moved with practiced precision, as if they'd done this many times before. My heart started racing as I watched them load their burden into the car's trunk. Something about the way they handled it, the careful movements, the hushed voices, it all felt wrong. Suddenly, one of them looked in my direction. I froze, pressing myself against the cold brick wall, praying the shadows were deep enough to conceal me. "Hey," he shouted. That was all I needed to hear. I ran, my feet barely touching the ground, as I sprinted away from the foundry. I could hear the car's engine roar to life behind me, tires screeching on gravel. I dove into the nearest alleyway, my lungs burning as I ran through the maze of back streets I'd known since childhood. The sound of the car grew distant, then faded entirely. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I emerged onto a main street, trying to look casual despite my racing heart. That's when I saw the same black sedan, crawling along the road like a predator searching for prey. I ducked behind some overgrown bushes, holding my breath as the car passed by, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. The next morning, everything changed. Police cars surrounded the foundry, their lights flashing against the weathered brick walls. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the morning breeze. 2 officers stood talking to a crying woman, their faces grim. What followed was like something out of a nightmare. The foundry wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a front for a criminal organization that had been operating in our area for years. The machines I'd heard weren't just random noises. They were part of something much darker. Over the next few weeks, details emerged. The organization had connections across the state, tentacles reaching into every aspect of local business and politics. They'd been using the foundry as a hub for their operations, taking advantage of its isolated location and the town's tendency to look the other way. The man they'd killed, Anthony Martinez, had been trying to break free from the organization. He'd been gathering evidence, planning to go to the authorities. They found out. The night I saw them, they were disposing of his body, wrapping up their loose ends with the same efficiency they brought to all their operations. The investigation uncovered more than just murder. The foundry had been ground zero for a network of criminal activity that had been poisoning our town for decades. Money laundering, extortion, drug trafficking. It all traced back to that rusted building on the edge of town. But here's the part that still keeps me up at night. The corruption went deeper than anyone initially thought. Some of the officers working the case started acting strangely. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses changed their stories. The investigation that had started with such promise began to unravel. I kept my head down during all of this, never telling anyone what I'd seen that night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Cars would follow me for a few blocks before turning away. Unknown numbers would call my phone, hanging up as soon as I answered. The woman I saw crying that morning was Martinez's wife. She knew he'd been trying to get out, knew he was gathering evidence. But when she tried to continue what he'd started, she disappeared. The official story was that she'd moved away to start fresh. But everyone knew better. The foundry still stands, its shadows now darker than ever. The investigation eventually closed, with only a few low-level arrests to show for it. The organization adapted, evolved, became more careful. But they're still there, operating in the spaces between legitimate business and criminal enterprise. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear machinery running in that old building. But now I know better than to look. Some secrets are better left in the shadows, some questions better left unasked. The foundry taught me that there are 2 worlds in every small town. The one we see in daylight, and the one that operates in darkness. To this day, I avoid that part of town. Not because I'm afraid of the building itself, but because I know what it represents: the dark underbelly of small-town life, where power and corruption intertwine, where secrets are buried deeper than any foundation, and where asking the wrong questions can make you disappear. The black sedan still appears occasionally, prowling the streets like a reminder that some evils never truly die. They just learn to hide better in the shadows they create. There's an old hiking trail in Vermont's Green Mountains that locals tend to avoid, especially after sunset. I never understood why, until a seemingly ordinary Earth Day hike turned into something that still haunts my nightmares. My friend Andrea and I decided it would be perfect to celebrate the day by exploring one of the less traveled paths in the area. The trail we chose wasn't marked on most tourist maps. It wound through ancient forest, following a creek that carved its way through moss-covered rocks. Local hiking forums mentioned its pristine beauty, but also carried vague warnings about staying away after dark. We dismissed these as typical small-town superstition. We parked at the old ranger station around mid-afternoon. The lot was empty except for our car, which should have been our first warning. The trail started innocently enough, a narrow path cutting through towering maples and birch trees, their new spring leaves creating a gentle canopy overhead. Andrea and I were experienced hikers, familiar with various trails in the region, but this one felt different. The silence was profound. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the occasional sound of running water from the creek. We planned to smoke a little weed, take in nature, and appreciate Earth Day in our own way. About a mile in, we found a perfect spot near the creek. The water curved around a natural stone formation, creating a peaceful alcove. We could still see the main trail, but had enough privacy for our small celebration. For about 10 minutes, everything was perfect. Then we saw him. A man appeared on the main trail, moving with an unnatural stillness. He wore dark clothes that seemed to absorb the afternoon light, and his movements were too precise, too controlled. When I first spotted him, he was standing completely still, just watching us. We quickly packed up our stuff and moved further down the side trail, hoping to avoid an awkward encounter. After waiting what felt like a safe amount of time, we returned to the main path, planning to continue our hike. But something felt wrong. The air had grown heavier, and the silence in the forest had deepened. We walked further along the trail, and that's when we noticed he was following us. Not obviously, he maintained his distance, but every time I looked back, he was there, moving with that same unsettling precision. His face remained in shadow despite the afternoon light, and his footsteps made no sound on the leaf-strewn path. Andrea suggested taking a picture for social media near a particularly scenic overlook. As I raised my phone to capture the moment, I saw him again in the background. He was closer now, and I could make out more details. His clothes weren't just dark, they were stained with something that looked disturbingly like dried mud or worse. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with eyes that seemed to reflect no light. "He's checking for abandoned hikers," he said, his voice carrying an unnatural echo. "Securing the trail, making sure no one's left behind." The words made no sense, but they sent a chill down my spine. We needed to leave. Now, we started walking faster, trying to maintain our composure. The man kept pace, his movements becoming more erratic, almost spasmodic. When we looked back again, there were others with him, shadowy figures moving between the trees, all wearing similar stained clothing, all moving with that same wrong precision. Their footsteps made no sound, but we could hear their breathing, ragged, desperate sounds that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They were getting closer, their movements becoming more aggressive, more purposeful. We ran. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly before us, the trees closing in overhead, blocking out more and more light. Behind us, we could hear them calling to each other in voices that sounded barely human, strained, distorted sounds that made my skin crawl. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, we broke through to the parking lot. We jumped into the car, locked the doors, and sped away. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of them standing at the trail's edge, a group of gaunt, dark figures watching our departure with empty eyes. When we told the park rangers about what happened, they exchanged knowing looks but didn't seem surprised. They mentioned that section of trail had a history, hikers disappearing, strange sightings, unexplained sounds in the night. The locals called them the Watchers, entities that patrolled the ancient woods, searching for something only they understood. We later learned that the trail crossed over what was once sacred ground to indigenous peoples who lived in the area centuries ago. Their legends spoke of guardians who protected certain places in the forest, spirits that took human form, but moved wrong, spoke wrong, existed wrong. The official reports say that section of trail is now closed due to environmental concerns. But the locals know better. They say the Watchers are still there, still patrolling their territory, still searching for abandoned hikers to secure. I haven't been hiking since that day. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see them. Those gaunt figures moving through the trees with impossible grace, their hollow eyes reflecting nothing, their voices carrying messages that make no sense but fill you with primal dread. The trail is still there, winding through the green mountains. But if you value your safety, stay away. Some paths are meant to remain untraveled, some Watchers best left unwatched. And if you ever find yourself on a lonely trail and spot someone moving with unnatural stillness, watching you with eyes that don't reflect light, run. Run as fast as you can and don't look back, because they're always searching, always securing, always making sure no one's left behind. What I'm about to share still seems surreal, like a twisted nightmare that somehow leaked into reality. But every word is true, and the scars it left, both emotional and reputational, are still healing. I was 23 when this happened, fresh out of a serious relationship with Olivia, and everything in my life seemed relatively normal. That is, until things took a bizarre turn that would completely derail my life in ways I never could have anticipated. Olivia and I had been together for 2 years. We were pretty serious at first, but towards the end, things weren't working out. The breakup was amicable, or at least I thought it was. No drama, just one of those "we're better as friends" situations. We split up in early summer, and for the next month or so, everything seemed fine. Then came the first bombshell. I received a message from Olivia claiming she was pregnant with twins. The news hit me like a thunderbolt. We had always been careful, and something about the timing felt off since we'd been separated for months. But before I could process this information, she dropped another shocking revelation. She wanted to give the babies to my best friend Ruby. Ruby had been struggling with infertility issues for years. It was a source of deep pain for her, and she'd been devastated by her inability to have children. Somehow, Olivia had developed a friendship with Ruby and was now proposing this bizarre arrangement. When I mentioned this to Ruby, she had no idea what I was talking about. The whole situation started feeling increasingly unsettling. Something in my gut told me this wasn't right, but I couldn't piece together what was really happening. Weeks passed, and Olivia began posting cryptic messages on social media. They started subtly vague posts about stress and difficulty, but they quickly evolved into pointed accusations, painting me as an absent father who had abandoned her during pregnancy. She wrote about dealing with everything alone, about how my lack of involvement was causing her immense stress. The social media campaign worked. People in her life started commenting, supporting her narrative of me as this heartless monster who couldn't care less about her or our supposed unborn children. I was being vilified for a situation I barely understood. Ruby believing Olivia's pregnancy was real, because who would lie about something like that, became emotionally invested. The prospect of receiving these twins gave her hope, something she'd been desperately seeking. She became overwhelmed with emotion, telling me how much it meant that Olivia would give her this precious gift. I felt trapped. Guilty feelings began creeping in, even though I wasn't sure what was real anymore. Should I be more involved? Was I really being as callous as everyone seemed to think? Then came the crushing blow. 4 months into this supposed pregnancy, Olivia announced she had miscarried. But it wasn't just a tragic announcement, it was an accusation. According to her, the doctor had explicitly stated that the miscarriage was caused by the stress I had inflicted through my absence and lack of support. Ruby was shattered. Her dream of motherhood, so briefly within reach, had been snatched away. She turned her grief into anger, directing it squarely at me. Our friendship imploded in a spectacular fashion. She called me a monster, claiming I had indirectly caused the loss of these babies through my callous behavior. My attempts to explain myself fell on deaf ears. No one wanted to hear that I had doubts about the pregnancy's authenticity. The damage was done. Former friends gave me the cold shoulder, and I found myself increasingly isolated. The weight of guilt and social ostracism pushed me into a deep depression. I withdrew from social activities, falling into a cycle of work, gaming, and sleep, avoiding the judgmental stares and whispered comments. A year later, the truth finally emerged through one of Olivia's former friends. Maggie approached me, visibly uncomfortable, and revealed that Olivia had confessed the entire thing was fabricated. There had never been a pregnancy, no twins, no miscarriage. It was all an elaborate scheme, conceived for reasons I still can't fully comprehend. The aftermath was equally bizarre. Olivia went on to have 4 children with someone else, seemingly moving on as if nothing had happened. Ruby's life took an unexpected turn. She became involved in a completely different lifestyle, married to someone much younger, living a life that barely resembled her former self. The revelation of the truth brought little comfort. The damage to my reputation and relationships had already been done. It took years to rebuild trust with people who had believed Olivia's lies, and some relationships never recovered. What I learned from this experience is how easily a lie can destroy someone's life, how social media can be weaponized to create false narratives, and how people will believe the worst about you without questioning the truth. I also learned about the importance of trusting your instincts. That nagging feeling that something isn't right often deserves more attention than we give it. I still struggle to understand Olivia's motivations. Was it revenge, a cry for attention, or something more complex? I'll probably never know. What I do know is that the experience changed me fundamentally, made me more cautious, more skeptical, but also more empathetic to others who find themselves caught in webs of lies and manipulation. The scars remain, but they've healed into something like wisdom. I've learned to value truth over appearances, to trust my instincts, and to recognize that sometimes the most devastating weapons aren't physical. They're the stories people tell about us when we're not there to defend ourselves. I've hesitated to share this story because it still haunts me, still makes me check my locks twice at night, still causes me to scan every crowd for a familiar face I hope never to see again. But I feel I need to share this as a warning to others who might find themselves in a similar situation. I met Thomas when I was 21. He was 26, charming in that subtle way that makes you feel special without being obvious about it. Our relationship lasted only 6 months, but its aftermath would haunt me for years to come. At first, everything seemed normal, great even. Thomas was attentive, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in my life. The age gap didn't seem significant. He appeared mature and stable. But looking back, I can see the red flags I missed, the warning signs that were there from the beginning. After 6 months, I ended things. It wasn't that Thomas was a bad person, at least, I didn't think so at the time, but something felt off. I needed space to breathe, to be myself. The breakup seemed amicable enough. We parted ways, and I thought that was the end of it. A month passed without incident. Then the messages started. Simple at first, "I miss you and we could make this work." I didn't respond, hoping he'd get the message. Instead, the tone shifted dramatically. The messages became angry, accusatory. "You've ruined my life, and you'll regret leaving me." I blocked his number, thinking that would solve the problem. It didn't. He started emailing me, finding new ways to contact me. The messages grew more intense, more disturbing. He began sending screenshots of conversations we'd had months ago, analyzing them in disturbing detail, twisting innocent words into something sinister. Then came the photo. It was of me, shopping at my local grocery store, taken without my knowledge. The angle suggested he had been watching from across the street. The message attached read, "You look beautiful when you don't know you're being watched." That's when I went to the police. They took my statement, looked at the messages, and contacted Thomas. They warned him that further harassment would have legal consequences. I thought that would be enough to stop him. I was wrong. A few months later, I changed jobs, moving to a new city hoping for a fresh start. For a while, it seemed to work. Then one day, I received an email at my new work address. The subject line read, "You can't escape me." The content made me physically ill. Details about my new work schedule, my daily coffee stop, my commute route. He ended with a clear threat. I'll be watching until you talk to me again. You can't hide from me. The police got involved again, but there was little they could do without more concrete evidence of immediate danger. That's when I discovered Thomas had gotten married during the 2 years since we'd last spoken. After a particularly frightening message that promised to make sure you never forget what we had, I made the difficult decision to contact his wife. At first, she didn't believe me, but when I showed her the evidence, the texts, the emails, the disturbing messages, her disbelief turned to horror. She asked for copies of everything, and I sent them. Some of his writings were so twisted, I could barely read them. Descriptions of how he would make me his again. Threats about hurting anyone who got close to me. For a while after that, things were quiet. I thought maybe his wife's intervention had finally put an end to it. Then I started seeing him. Not just online anymore, but in person, watching from across the street, following me in his car. One night, I saw him standing outside my apartment building, just staring up at my window. I filed for a restraining order. The police increased their patrols in my area. But 9 years later, I still get messages from blocked numbers. Sometimes they're angry threats. Sometimes they're comments about places I've been recently proof he's still watching. I've tried dating, mainly through trusted friends' introductions, but Thomas always seems to find out. His messages become increasingly violent, threatening to eliminate any man who gets close to me. I've changed jobs multiple times, moved to new places, switched social media accounts, but nothing seems to stop him. He always finds a way back into my life. The police are involved again, but I can't shake the feeling that nothing will truly stop him. This kind of obsession isn't love, it's a sickness, a dangerous fixation that can destroy lives. I've learned to be hypervigilant, to always be aware of my surroundings, to never take my safety for granted. I have security cameras, carry personal alarms, and have changed every aspect of my life to protect myself. The most terrifying part isn't the threats or the stalking. It's the knowledge that someone can become so fixated, so obsessed, that they're willing to spend years of their life pursuing someone who wants nothing to do with them. It's the understanding that no matter how many times you move, how many numbers you change, how many restraining orders you file, they might still be out there, watching, waiting. For anyone reading this who might be experiencing something similar, take it seriously from the start. Document everything. Trust your instincts. Don't wait to get help. Obsession can turn dangerous quickly, and what might seem like desperate attention-seeking can evolve into something much more sinister. I still live with this reality every day. Every unknown number that calls, every shadow that moves in the dark, every stranger who looks at me too long. They all carry the possibility that it's him, still watching, still waiting, still refusing to let go of an obsession that has consumed nearly a decade of both our lives. I met Alice a little over a year ago through mutual friends. She seemed perfect, brilliant, funny, creative, with this magnetic energy that drew people to her. After a few weeks of casual dating, we fell into what felt like a dream relationship. But sometimes dreams can turn into nightmares, and the signs aren't always clear until it's too late. The first red flags were subtle. Alice wanted to know where I was constantly, not in an obvious way at first, just casual check-ins that seemed born of genuine interest. If I didn't respond within an hour, I'd get multiple texts in succession. Initially, I found it endearing, thinking she just cared deeply about staying connected. But gradually, the behavior intensified. She started appearing unannounced, not just at my apartment, but at my friends' houses too. If I went for drinks with colleagues, she'd somehow know where we were and show up without warning. When I traveled for work, she'd text me saying she was checking on my apartment to make sure everything was okay. I tried to address it gently, suggesting that we needed to respect each other's space. She'd brush it off, insisting she was just being caring and attentive. The control grew tighter. She began questioning my friendships, particularly with female colleagues. She'd go through my phone while I was sleeping, checking messages and call logs. After 6 months, I felt like I was suffocating. Every aspect of my life was under surveillance. I couldn't make a simple decision without considering how Alice would react. That's when I knew I had to end it. When I broke things off, she didn't cry or get angry. She just smiled in a way that made my blood run cold. The real nightmare began after the breakup. At first, the texts seemed normal expressions of regret and requests to try again. When I didn't respond, the messages turned dark. "You'll never find anyone who loves you like I do," she'd write. "You're going to regret this. I won't let you go." Then I started finding notes on my car, handwritten messages tucked under the windshield wipers. The first one simply read, "I'm watching you." The next day, another appeared, "You're not safe without me," accompanied by a drawing of a heart pierced by an arrow. One evening, I came home to find my door slightly ajar. My heart stopped. Inside, things were subtly wrong: couch cushions rearranged, clothes moved in my closet. On my kitchen counter, I found a photograph of myself taken that morning at the grocery store. I hadn't seen anyone following me, hadn't noticed anyone taking pictures. But there I was, captured in a moment when I thought I was alone. I went to the police, but they said they couldn't do much without direct threats or evidence of physical danger. I changed my locks, installed security cameras, blocked her on every platform I could think of. But Alice was always one step ahead. She knew my routines, my habits, my favorite places. I'd walk into my regular coffee shop, and there she'd be, sitting in the corner, watching me with that same cold smile. At the gym, she'd appear on the treadmill next to mine, acting as if everything was normal. "Just getting some exercise," she'd say, her voice carrying an undercurrent of threat. The stalking became more sophisticated. Packages started arriving at my door, small things at first, like my favorite candy or books. Then they became more disturbing. One day, I received a small bag containing strands of my own hair. The note attached read, "Every piece of you belongs to me." I filed for a restraining order, and for a while it seemed to work. But then one night, walking home late, I spotted her standing across the street under a streetlight. She didn't approach, didn't speak, just stood there watching me with that unnervingly empty smile. "I'll always be watching you," she called out before walking away into the darkness. The next day, I packed my essential belongings and moved to a different city. I changed my phone number, email, and deleted all social media. I got a new job and started fresh. But even now, months later, I still look over my shoulder. I check my locks twice every night. I scan every room I enter for her face. The worst part isn't the fear of physical harm. It's the psychological torture of knowing someone is out there, watching, waiting, believing they have some kind of claim on your life. It's the way it changes how you move through the world, how you interact with others, how you trust. I've started dating again, cautiously, but the fear remains. Every time I meet someone new, I wonder if Alice will find out, if she'll try to eliminate the competition, as she once threatened. I've learned to be more careful about who I let into my life, to trust my instincts when something feels off. The experience taught me that obsession can wear a beautiful face, that control can masquerade as care, and that some people will go to extraordinary lengths to maintain their illusion of possession. It's changed how I view relationships, making me more cautious, but also more appreciative of genuine, healthy connections. To anyone who recognizes these warning signs in their own relationship, the constant monitoring, the unannounced visits, the gradual isolation from friends, get out early. Don't wait until the control is complete. Don't dismiss your instincts. The longer you stay, the harder it becomes to break free, and the more dangerous the aftermath can be. Alice is still out there somewhere. Sometimes I still get calls from unknown numbers, messages from anonymous accounts. Each time my heart races, wondering if she's found me again. But I won't live in fear forever. I'm stronger now, wiser, and I know that no one has the right to turn love into a prison. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.